Hi, welcome to this edition of Valley View. I'm your host, Ken Adams, and this week we have Delana Beaton with us, who's going to talk about the recent Homeless Forum. Delana actually put this thing together in an extremely short period of time, and the mayor and all sorts of groups came out for this. I was totally impressed, but it's a serious subject that I don't think gets addressed very often, so that's why I asked Delana to come in and talk a little bit about the forum and where do we go from here. So maybe you can tell us what your impetus was for getting this thing together.
Ken, thank you for inviting me. I think this is an issue that our community really needs to address at this time. It was a shock to me to learn of the loss of 24 of our family housing units out of a total of 39. What we've lost is the 14 units housing families at Salem Outreach Shelter. That shelter is now completely closed. We've also lost the 10 units sheltering families at the Salvation Army shelter, which is now totally closed for renovation, but will reopen in January. But when they reopen, they will have eliminated their 10 family units. So they'll be sheltering only single men and single women. What's remaining are, we have some wonderful shelters remaining. We have St. Francis Shelter, which is doing an excellent job, and they have 11 sheltering units for homeless families. And then the Interfaith Hospitality Network, which is a consortium of cooperating churches who house 4 families at a time. Each congregation gives them dinner, overnight lodging, and breakfast at a week at a time, and then they rotate. We also have the Women's Crisis Service, right, which is a very it's a specialized shelter. They have 22 beds, and they are always full and over capacity, and they house victims of domestic violence.
And what was the reason that all these family facilities were shut down? I mean, you say that they're closing for renovation and like that, but was there a problem with them doing this, and that's why they're being closed, or is there something else going on?
You know, I wish there was a really simple answer. I guess if we had to choose one simple answer, it would be lack of adequate funding, because we've also lost the transitional housing shelter of Host, which housed homeless teens and gave them case management. And that, it was completely funded by a federal funding stream, which just recently was ended. So we've lost that shelter for homeless teens. Salem Outreach Shelter was lost because of funding issues. It's a very expensive type of a shelter,
right,
and probably is not, that kind of funding is probably not sustainable anymore, is what we're finding as we get data from across the nation. Many shelters of that model, which was the one big shelter building, lots of families living there. It's very expensive because you have to pay the maintenance and utilities and mortgages on the building, but if you have lots of people in it at the same time, you have to also pay for round-the-clock staffing, which becomes very expensive. So I think if we had to sum it up, we'd say loss of federal funds, closed Host, transitional program, loss of a large package of funds, closed Salem Outreach Shelter, which was under the auspices of the YWCA, who didn't want to close the shelter, but they just could not afford that model anymore. Salvation Army, I've talked to some of their staff, and it wasn't lack of funding as much as feeling that they were most comfortable serving single men and single women, and that maybe in the future they would like to renovate a house, for example, and house families, but do that in a separate building.
But this is kind of a, you know, it used to be what you'd see is mostly single men at single occupancy hotels and things like that.
Right.
And you know, over the last 30 years or so, you know, it kind of grew to a very large degree. And you started seeing single women, but now during the last couple of downturns in the economy, you see whole families, and they're not able to get back on their feet because the jobs aren't there, or whatever. Because once you become homeless, it's a very difficult task to get back out, because I mean, you have all sorts of problems like trying to keep clean. You know, you're living in the car or out in the streets. It's hard, and you often have to walk long distances to get food or other things, other necessities. So and I've known several homeless people during my life, and like it was like a full-time job just being homeless. And I don't think people sometimes understand the kind of energy and time that you spend, just trying to survive when you're homeless.
Right.
And
you're right, Ken. All the data indicates that there has been a seismic shift in homeless population and the demographics in the last 25 to 30 years. More and more of our homeless are families, young parents and their young children. One statistic that always just shocks me, even though I've been aware of these kinds of things for a few years, I am still just stunned. The average age of a homeless person in Marion County is 9. These are kids. And so we've got a lot of families, they've lost a job, or the parents become ill and can't work. They're evicted, they lose their apartment, their home is foreclosed, whatever has gotten them out on the streets. There are a lot of hidden homeless, is what I call them, because they really don't have a home of their own, but they're doubled up with a friend, or they're couch surfing.
with several friends.
With several friends, exactly. And it's very hard to do with children. Then we see kids are in multiple schools in a year, and it's very damaging to the quality of their education.
Yeah, and I worked at State and High School for a while, about 5 years ago, and it wasn't special needs, it was more like juvenile delinquents. But it kind of really broke my heart one time, because I was talking to this young boy who was now 18. He'd been in a foster home, and the foster family wasn't getting any more funds, so he was basically turned loose. But he's still trying to go to school, and what he was doing was he was spending time 2 or 3 days with this friend, 2 or 3 days with that friend, and like that. And he was one of the better behaved kids in the classroom, and he couldn't, he's homeless.
Right.
And he wasn't the only one in that class that was homeless.
Oh, no.
And I mean, and that's something that I think a lot of times people don't realize, is if you're in foster care and you turn 18, you don't have any kind of support system.
No, you're just out.
Yeah.
Salem Kaiser Public Schools at this time estimates between 800 and 1,000. It's 800 kids, or to 1,000 children in Salem Kaiser who are homeless. They're known to be homeless.
They're known to be
They're
homeless.
known to be homeless. So the actual figure is no doubt much larger than that.
And now, usually about this time of year, they have in the past, they've gone and tried to do a homeless count.
That's true. That will happen in January this year.
And so like last year, what was the number that they came up with for Salem?
I can't give you a total on that right now. I could get back to you with that.
Okay.
I do know that they found over 600 homeless military vets in Salem alone, men and women. The homeless count is each year organized and handled by Community Action Agency, and the people who help do that count are knowledgeable about where to go. So it's, but I just recently spoke to one of their staff who told me they feel that they do underreport because it's done in January, and that's a federal choice, not a local choice. People are not just out walking around or sleeping openly on benches in that kind of weather.
Right.
So we'd probably have a better, more accurate count in a warmer months, who knows.
If we ever get to those warmer months.
Should they come, right.
And
right.
that, this last spell of weather has been particularly cold.
Yes.
I mean, it has been a lot colder than our normal Oregon winter. And so the other thing is too is that people burn up a lot of calories when it's cold,
Absolutely.
and that becomes an added problem,
Yes.
making sure that they're properly fed.
Right. Well, and there's concern about keeping the core, the body core, warm enough for health. If people's core begins to chill, then they're at greater risk for whatever from the cold. We did have a warming tent open here in Salem in Marion Street Park, downtown, for 3 nights, last Friday night, Saturday night, and Sunday night. But it was closed at 10 a.m. Monday morning. That warming tent was up for those 3 nights, a joint cooperation of Marion County and the city of Salem.
But it's still pretty cold out there.
Very cold.
Yes. So you've given us kind of an idea, but I mean, it's something that's quite often somewhat hidden.
Yes.
And a lot of people don't want to look at homeless people if they see them on the street or
That's
waiting on
right.
the corner.
That's
But
right.
it's become a lot worse, and it's a lot, and a lot of times various cities or localities have tried to push the homeless out. There's various cities now that don't want the homeless fed. And I just think it's particularly ironic, I guess, at this time of the year, we say don't feed the homeless, and I mean it's a community concern. And
Very much so.
I think a lot of times people are worried about themselves ending up in that situation.
Yes, right. We're fortunate in Marion and Polk counties to have Marion Polk Food Share, which by everyone's report is doing an outstanding job of making food available through their distribution centers. That's a separate issue, of course, from
Right.
housing. Yeah. I think what you're wondering about is what you're wondering about our community's collective attitude toward the homeless?
Well, that is part of, I was glad to see the mayor come to the
I was
the
very
homeless
glad.
forum.
Yes.
And she had some, I thought some empathy for what was
Yes.
happening, and she's
Yes.
kind of limited, as is the city government.
Yes.
But they're still there, and these people, as far as I'm concerned, need to be taken care of. And
Right.
we don't, this is part of our community, and it needs to be taken care of in some fashion. And there were some concrete suggestions during the forum about different models.
Right.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about what some of the studies have indicated might be a better model.
Other cities, about 20 years ago, started experimenting with a newer way of what they call it rehousing the homeless, getting them back through the stream into independent living in their own homes. And they find it more cost-effective than bringing homeless families together in the one large shelter model. And it's a leasing program where some nonprofit or government entity, different groups have taken leadership in different cities. But what they do is the same. They find landlords who are willing to use all or part of their apartments that can be available as leased, and they're leased by this entity who then puts a homeless family into an apartment. There's intensive case management, and the case managers rotate among the clients in the apartments. You don't bring them all together into one big shelter unit. So you save a lot of money by not needing to man that big shelter and heat it. And you give a lot more dignity to the families. As a retired therapist and counselor, I think there's a tremendous amount of advantage for the families. The kids aren't dropped off from the school bus in front of the shelter.
Right.
They're just moved into the apartment next door.
Yeah, and I mean, that does seem like a better system,
Yeah.
that they at least have some independence and, but it's kind of limited as how long they can stay there.
It's both. Those apartments can be used as transition shelter, just like the big sheltering
Okay.
building had been. And that's typically 6-month limit with turnover averaging about every 3 months. And the whole concept of transitional shelter is what the name implies. You're helping them transition from homelessness to their own home unit. Some of these families are transitioning in place. So they are then taking on the lease for that apartment themselves in their own name, typically using subsidized housing vouchers, and then getting established. And then as they get back into employment and income, they could stay there or move on to another place of their choice. What the comparative costs are, that the most expensive unit in dollars is the homeless shelter, the big shelter. And that was averaging here in Salem between $2,400 and $2,700 per month per family, which is obviously unsustainable. We can't keep that up. And that's why it's
Right.
closed. The next most expensive option is used by a lot of cities, which is to use their dollars for serving the homeless to house them in hotels or motels. Just pay
Right.
the rent. And that's the second most expensive. The least expensive per family per night by far, it's a huge jump down, is the master leased program, where you lease an apartment and house them there. Per night costs get down to like $20 a night per family.
So that's about $600 a month, which is kind of a normal rent for,
Right.
for most folks.
Yeah.
And so that's the best model.
Right.
But you have to have enough units to make that work, and
That's right.
there's still going to be a fair amount of homeless families. And
You know, it depends on what the community can develop and coordinate. We need there are a lot of conversations going on right now among the nonprofits, the city, the county, the Red Cross, United Way, many voices in these conversations to see what would be a way for Salem Kaiser to create some kind of a unifying entity that could take the leadership in recruiting the landlords, because we still need the apartments, the place,
Right.
and then planning case management for the families, coordinating it all, making it work. It's a big undertaking, but I think it can be done, and many other communities are already doing this and have done it for 10 to 15 years with excellent track records.
and that makes more sense than going out and buying land and building something.
Building a new shelter or building a new apartments, yes.
Yeah, and I know that when I lived in Sacramento, what they did is they built some small, very small, like 200 square feet homes to shelter folks, and they were kind of like in a little village.
Right.
But that, I think the houses for 200 square feet, they were being
pretty
built for
small.
like, yeah, but it was costing them with the land and everything else. It was like $40,000 a piece.
Wow.
So, that is a big undertaking.
Well, and there are other studies that indicate the tremendous benefit to families and their children if you don't create a homeless ghetto, so to
Right.
speak. If we have them in these master leased units spread out all over the community, then they're just neighbors,
Right.
you know.
So I take it, though, that we need more units here in Salem.
Absolutely.
And so the funding that we have currently is going for that. So how can we expand that to accommodate more or most of the homeless in our
Right.
community?
How can we expand our supply of both apartments and case management services to match our need? Is
Right. Yes.
That's the operative question. And I think, Ken, that we need more voices in the community involved. As I indicated, there are already many people meeting and starting to talk about this, and that's excellent and certainly the needed first step. But I think it's going to take a community-wide effort to solve this. It comes down to what kind of a community we want to have. What's the heart of Salem going to look like?
And that includes everybody in the community.
Everybody. Right.
And
Right.
so, in your experience, what is the major causes of people becoming homeless? I mean, is that something maybe that we could work on as well? Make sure that people aren't falling into that homeless situation in the first place?
Oh, that would be the ultimate goal. It's, it's kind of like the dentist saying his goal is to eliminate a need for his job by everybody having wonderful oral hygiene. Well, we'd love to eliminate any needs for jobs of dealing with homelessness by having no one be homeless. There are a lot of barriers. You indicated some of them earlier. If you are homeless and you're on the streets, how do you apply for a job? You don't have a mailing address or phone number for an employer to even get back to you.
Right.
You can't get a shower and get clean. You don't have a wash machine. Just the act of grooming yourself and being clean and presentable is a real challenge. So those things become barriers.
Well, not only that, but here in Salem, there isn't a whole lot of public transportation,
No.
which also then creates another problem because you'll probably have to walk wherever you're
That's
going.
right.
And I mean, the public transportation basically stops at dark and isn't available on weekends.
Right.
And this is something, that I think I alluded to it during the forum, is that businesses need to kind of step up because the parking situation downtown has gotten a lot worse. And they need to bring more people into downtown. I think they really need to start considering having decent transportation in Salem that isn't just during the daylight hours.
It would be
And-
wonderful. The problem is that we, the public, defeated the last bond
I
measure
understand that, but
for
maybe
the chariots.
people can start to see a little bit behind the scenes that they're creating more problems for themselves. And
Right.
I mean, Salem doesn't have a tremendous traffic problem, but it would be nice to at least have the ability to take public transportation.
Yes.
And I think as energy becomes more expensive, this is going to become more critical for more people.
Yeah.
That the end of cheap energy is past us, and so we need to start looking at other ways to get around from point A to point B. And the homeless could then, or people that don't have sufficient income currently would have other ways of getting around other than just walking.
Right, because, it isn't just, in terms of talking about public transportation and the
Right.
people needing that, it isn't just the homeless. We have
Right.
this whole other group called the working poor, many of whom are still in housing, but they're hungry. They're paying their rent, but they can't pay for heat or adequate food, but they're just in the places. So that's a quality of life issue that's related to homelessness, but a little bit different.
Right. But I mean, it is a situation that would benefit more than the homeless, but
Right.
the homeless could certainly
Right.
take advantage of the
Absolutely.
situation if there was more public
Well,
transportation.
after I retired as a counselor, I did two approximately 1-year terms as interim executive director of Salem Outreach Shelter. This was about 10 years ago. And I was constantly struck by this, the difficulties from the lack of public transportation. For example, we had one mother who worked she was a wonderful cook. She got a job in the bakery at Winco on South Commercial, but she couldn't get back home. So she finally had to leave because her shift ended after the buses stopped running. And we tried getting volunteers to drive down and pick her up, and she tried walking all the way back to Center.
Right.
I mean, it just wasn't workable. But yeah, you raise a very good point.
Yeah. Well, I can think of numerous situations that have come up and that have to do with transportation
Right.
with people that don't make a lot of money
Right.
because they can't all afford cars.
No.
And we're geared that way. But that's kind of a different subject.
That's a whole, yeah.
Yes. So, we do have people watching the show, and I'd like for you to address maybe what people can do at home to maybe help out with this situation. Maybe we could spend a few minutes on that.
Well, what comes to my mind first with that question, Ken, is to give support to the nonprofits and the entities in Salem that are still here and working well. They need more support. You could give donations to the Women's Mid-Valley Women's Crisis Service. They're in a capital campaign now because they've been so chronically over capacity that they're adding some units. Samanka House, the women's wing of Union Gospel Mission, has just opened new beds. St. Francis Shelter, which we mentioned earlier, running very well, but always, most of these places are right on the edge. So if we want our surviving shelters to continue to survive, we need to support them. The city of Salem, understandably, has created a task force on panhandling, which is a growing concern and is related to homelessness. And the recommendations coming out of that task force is to not give panhandlers money, but to perhaps carry with you in your car, a little box or bag of warm socks, energy bars, gloves, juices, something like that, so that you're not passing these needing people by without giving them something. That would be if you want to give things like that to someone else to distribute, you could go, for instance, to Northwest Human Services,
which is on Center Street.
Center Street, yes. The 700 block, I don't remember the exact address, but it's in the phone directory. Northwest Human Services has a van that regularly circulates and distributes things that are badly needed to get people through these cold nights.
So maybe we could juice, energy bars, warm socks,
gloves,
sweatshirt, whatever.
Scarf, whatever.
Yeah.
Just think what you would need if you were going to be outdoors all night tonight. Yeah, because hundreds are.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But I mean, that is something that I think people do need to. I kind of like that suggestion of maybe just carrying something in the car, so the next time you see somebody there at the corner,
you can say, "Would you like?
Would you like this?"
Yeah.
And actually, in talking to homeless people, I think that's another thing that it's helpful. It's not anything great, but just talking to them and recognizing them as people on the street, I think would go a lot to helping them at least feel like they're part of the community still. Because a lot of people just don't look at them or talk to them or basically ignore them. And I think
they are part of the community.
That's right.
There are friends and neighbors who have lost their homes and their jobs.
Right. And I mean, to me, that's it's kind of sad.
It's very sad.
And over the years, I've known many homeless people out on the streets, and I try to make it a point to talk to them, because sometimes maybe they just need a little bit of help that you can quite easily supply. And, it can make a big difference to those folks.
Well, they put out a call for volunteers to help staff the warming tent. It was open for those 3 nights, and my husband and I took a 4-hour shift and had most interesting conversations with many homeless people. And one man gave me his email address. He goes into the public library and he can't use the computer in the public library. And I said, what do you need most? And well, he has an old bike, but it didn't have brakes or lights, and now the pedals have fallen off. And so I still want to use that email address and get back to him and see what I can do about the bike.
Okay, and we're going to have to leave it there.
Okay.
And I want to thank you, Delana, for coming on the show, but also for putting together the forum. And I want to welcome the viewers to watch next time, and we'll be on a different topic. And thank you for watching.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.